Well, good afternoon. We're so glad that those of you who are here could make it with us today. We're so excited to offer this free webinar, really thinking about how can we help you and learn from you really, but share what we know as well about trauma. We know it's a big topic right now. It's something that's affecting so many kids in schools and teachers and their families, that we thought this was a good time to really bring up this topic. And so one of the things we want to do is we've got a little bit of content to offer, and then we really want to hear from you and field some questions that you might have. And so just as way of introduction, my name is Rhonda Vincent. I serve as the Director of Educational Training at Momentous, and my background is in education. So in as far as any of these questions relate to campuses or schools or students, I'll try to weigh in as best as I can. And then my colleague Tina, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Tina. I'm a clinical social worker, and I'm the Director of Clinical Training here at Momentous. Rhonda and I are kind of the two-part voice that represents our intersection of mental health and education. So whenever we train out or partner out in the community, we do so with a therapist and an educator. And so I'm the therapist on the team, although Rhonda's gotten really therapist-y lately. I don't think that's a word, but she has. And I kind of have learned a lot about the education lens. So we'll both be representing today, answering questions you have at that intersection, and particularly as it relates to trauma. I'm trying to move us on here. I think I'm stuck. I am. I'm going to get out and come back in, you all. I'm sorry about that. No, well. While we're trying to get this issue resolved, will you all take a moment and just put some questions into the Q&A and to the chat that you have, and let us try to get this PowerPoint thing. Is giving Rhonda and me issues today. We're not really sure what's going on here, but we'll get it figured out.
You want me to go ahead and put mine up, and we can go from that? Are you able to see it?
Okay, we can see it. Perfect. Thank you.
Perfect.
All right. Let's go to the next slide.
It didn't go to the next slide yet. Hold on a second. Okay, how's that? It's a lizard, isn't it?
Can't see it. I'm not sure what's happening with our PowerPoint today.
Okay.
Okay, so they can see the slides advancing there. So thank you for that, feedback. Okay.
Apologize, everyone. So what you're seeing here is a graphic that really describes who we are at Momentous. So hopefully we were talking to some existing friends, but if not, and you don't know a lot about Momentous, this graphic just really tells who we are and how we do our work. We are a nonprofit organization in Dallas, Texas, and we have quite a long history. We have about 100 years of history working with the community. There are three elements of our organization. The first one is our lab school. So we have a functioning lab school serving kids from 3 years old to 5th grade. We also have therapeutic services, which provide direct therapy services to youth and family. And then finally, we have our research and training, which is the department Tina and I really spend most of our time in. where we share out what we've learned and we learn from others, and we are researching what we're doing and following the research of what other people are doing. So that's a little bit about how we do our work. So this slide here will show us how we really distilled our understanding of social emotional health. So it's really our stock and trade. It's what we've been working on for a very long time. And we define social emotional health as the ability to understand and manage your emotions, your reactions, and your relationships. So those three huge skill sets, if you try to think about people who, tend to do pretty well in life and tend to, get along with others and just kind of go with the flow a little bit, they probably have some social emotional health. People who really struggle, including children who really struggle to get along, to, kind of, just succeed in the classroom, succeed in life, make relationships and friendships that are positive and successful, they might struggle a little bit with some social emotional health skills. So we like to think about social emotional health as these three abilities.
So Rhonda gave you an overview of Momentous, and of course, one of the key factors about our work is that as we serve our school partners, we really bring in the mental health lens to inform a lot of it is of what we do. And so if we're going to really effectively support school children and really help them achieve those academic outcomes that we all want them to have, we need to be thinking about how they best learn. And so we have a strong focus on understanding the neurobiology of individuals. And that's not just for students, but that's teachers and administrators, because everybody in the school system experiences some level of trauma, even if it's a big T or a little t. So I want to say, for those of you who may just be joining in, we're going to do just a little bit of a level set. There's probably 3 or 4 slides, and we're just going to kind of review a quarter inch deep on trauma. Again, if you want more information on that and you feel like, hey, I would love to deepen my lens on that, please be sure to sign up for our trauma training. You can go to our website for the training that we offer, but we do have one that we offer pretty consistently around trauma, and it'll take you on a deep dive, because we really want to spend the majority of this time hearing from you and fielding your questions and kind of responding to that. So I wanted to put here on the screen this slide that talks about what trauma is, because there's so much information out there about being trauma informed. And so we want to make sure that we have a good, strong working definition that fits the neuroscience, and you'll understand that in a moment as we look at this definition. So trauma is, and this is a definition that we pull from the work of Peter Levine, who is one of the primary neuropsychiatrists in the work of trauma that helps to inform what we do. He's also a researcher. And so this definition really has 3 parts. So it's important to understand that trauma is the physiological, which is our body, and psychological, which is mind. So now we have neuro and biology in this definition, and it's distress. So it's a stress on the mind and the body, but it's also a response to an event. So it's important to know that trauma is not the event itself, that different people can witness the same event, and someone might experience trauma and someone else may not. So it's our response to something that happens. And then the third part of that definition is that it exceeds our individual ability to cope. So when our resources have been maximized, and many of the times that is from an involuntary perspective, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, then I may experience trauma. There are some situations that cause trauma for pretty much anyone. So we've all been in the midst of this pandemic. We've been at it for a while. Hopefully we're seeing a light at the end of the tunnel with the vaccine coming around and seeing some of those numbers drop. But if we're all really honest about it, we've all experienced some level of trauma because it's exceeded our ability to cope. We've lost some level of control in this experience. We can go to the next slide, Rhonda. So what happens when we are experiencing trauma is that our neurobiology is affected. So our fight, flight, freeze system is activated. Our nervous system activate so that we can respond to whatever threat it is that we're facing. So there are generally 3 responses. Now there's a 4th response that we're talking a lot more about now. So there's fight, flight, and freeze, but we also have another response to trauma that we call fawn. And there's a lot of good research around that. So we're going to talk just briefly about that today. And so be sure to come back to trauma training so you can get a little deeper dive on it. But our nervous system, our survival system that we're all blessed to have a stress response system that allows us to respond to events that are difficult and that exceed our ability to cope. And then we also have a stress relief system. So in the same body, we get a chance to respond to a threat and calm from the threat. But what happens is our body involuntarily kicks us into either a fight, flight, or freeze or a fawn experience. So if we go to the next slide, this will kind of give us an idea of what might fight, flight, and freeze. They actually look a lot like they sound. And so here's what we might see if a child in the school is engaged, or any individual actually is engaged in a particular area of their survival response system. And here's the thing to note about our survival system. These responses are involuntary. So we don't stop to think, man, I wonder what color that bear is that's coming toward me. Should I try to go around the left or the right? So our prefrontal cortex of our brain is really largely offline, and our body is involuntarily taking us through these responses to keep us safe. So we might experience fight, and that looks like fighting back or talking back or defending self. If you might experience that in school. So you may see that from a school child. You may even see it from an adult, maybe even a parent that you're working with. Potentially that could be fearful of something, or they have trauma responses that they're living with. So fight looks like this. Flight looks like just what it sounds like, or leaving or hiding or running away. That could also be avoidance. And then freeze is where we shut down, numb out, or dissociate. And dissociate simply means that we disconnect. And understand that these are often responses that are keeping us safe. So these are ways that we are coping with trauma we're experiencing. And what you'll learn when you come to our trauma training is that some of these responses, while they keep us safe in the moment for a threat, they are adaptive. So we're adapting to what's happening to us in the moment where there's a threat. But when these behaviors continue and there's no threat around, or someone may perceive there's a threat, when those behaviors continue in certain contexts, they become what we say is maladaptive, meaning that they don't work for that particular context and environment. So what we see often in schools is that you will see that children that are experiencing behavior challenges, many of them are using their survival coping skills that have kept them alive in other situations, but they are not necessarily adaptive. They become maladaptive in a school context, or even in a church context, or some other context to where a different type of behavior is expected. So we have to help kids understand, number one, what's happening with the neurobiology, and then help them understand how to calm down. Now, I want to say this real quickly before we go to the next slide. This 4th response that we're doing more research around is the fawn response. So what happens in a fawn response is that you'll see someone may go along to get along, but they're actually afraid or scared. So they might befriend someone. So if someone feels like that they have to go along with the situation in order for them to survive, you see this a lot in environments where there's heavy control in a particular context, and that person may feel like there's no way around, so they will people please, and they'll go along so they can survive and stay in some level of connection in that relationship. So let's go to the next slide. And we'll look at what these fight, flight, freeze responses might look like from an adult who might be in the system. This could actually be, I know this slide comes from our culturally responsive, a book from an educator who's looking at culturally responsive education. So this slide really is more related to teachers or adults or those in the system who are working with kids. So I'll give you a chance to look at those. I'm not going to read through those because you can see those for yourself. But when you look at those should correlate in some way to the slide that you just saw. So if you see fight, there's some kind of more aggressive behavior or action to defend. And then flight, when you see that section there, you'll see more of where you have those kind of those avoidance or trying to get away from something. And then when you look in freeze, it's that shutdown that we talked about, that's kind of dissociating or disconnecting, or just needing to be completely in an isolated situation. What you would see with a fawn from an adult in the system would be very similar to what we talked about before, that maybe there's a person who doesn't always, and it's fawn, yes, F-A-W-N. So it's fawning or feigning as if something's happening to me, or that I'm going along, again, just to get along. So let's go to the next slide. And then once we finish this slide, we'll be ready for our Q&A. Yes, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Before you go to the next slide, I think it might be good timely right now to answer Terry's question. She was saying, is the fawn level applicable to victims of domestic violence? So she thinks—
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for finding that question in the chat, Rhonda. No, that's an absolutely great example of what fawning might look like. One of the areas that we got to do some research in fawning is thinking about individuals who've been kidnapped, or a child who's been taken by one parent from another parent, and wants to get back to the parent that may have been taken from, but they're just trying to get along to stay alive with the person that has them. So we've looked at that in captor situations. And so, so if you think about any context where someone feels like they cannot get away and they want to try to stay alive or survive in that context. And it's not always a life or death situation. It could be just something heavy control, and you feel like this is an environment where I don't have a voice, or someone doesn't see me, but I need for that person to accept me. So I'm gonna do whatever it is that I think I need to do so that they can see me or connect with me. So want to make sure that we think about fawn in different contexts, that it's not always life and death, but there are environments where individuals decide that they're going to please and just go along. Okay. Any other thoughts on that? So here we are with the last slide before we kind of get into the Q&A piece. So when we talk about trauma, we have to look at the neurobiology, right? So when we understand that trauma response is a brain-body response, then we understand what we have to do as strategies for dealing with trauma. And this is especially important in schools because, again, we want kids to be in their prefrontal cortex of their brain. So we have another training, brain and self-regulation, that we'd like to invite you to. We know there's a lot of training out there and conversation about neuroscience, but in case you want to go a little deeper in that, please feel free to sign up for that training. But when we think about the priority strategy for dealing with trauma, it's not necessarily thinking about, hey, we've got to make sure kids learn, so we want to do this in the school, maybe we'll have this campaign, maybe we'll work with the parent. The number one strategy for dealing with trauma is to calm the nervous system. What we know from our work in trauma is that when the nervous system is calm, then the prefrontal cortex, the learning part of the brain, the rational, executive functioning, decision-making part of the brain that needs to take in all the stuff you're trying to teach. In order for it to do that, the nervous system has to be calmed, or we say tamping it down. And so once that happens, then the brain can begin to function and bring its full self into the classroom. So it's a two-parter. When we calm the nervous system, we're also calming the brain. So that's why we do a lot of regulation strategies in the work of trauma. When you come to the trauma training, we cover a range of those, but that's part of why you have calm down corners in your school, because you're trying to calm the nervous system. That's part of the reason why you breathe throughout the day. You're trying to calm the nervous system. That's one of the reasons why we do progressive muscle relaxation or tapping, or even why it's important to have movement in art and music, because humming, all of those kinds of strategies help to calm the nervous system. So that's the number one strategy for schools. And my encouragement is, as we get ready for the questions, is that if you are an administrator that's happens to be on this call, that you think about what is one particular goal, what is one particular strategy that I can have for my entire campus that helps us calm nervous system. Not just for kids, but for adults as well, because adults also experience trauma and we can be triggered by the trauma of kids. So we all need to tamp down our nervous systems through the day. So that's just a real short kind of overview of the basics of trauma. Again, we go a lot deeper in that. And so now we want to just take a moment to entertain questions that you might have.
And while those questions come in, I wanted to add my educator lens real quickly to this whole idea of calming down the nervous system. Having worked as a teacher for a lot of years and having worked with lots of teachers, I know that we spend tons of time developing our lessons and picking out the right instructional strategies and the right materials, but we don't often think about how are we going to normalize for stress and plan those opportunities to really bring the nervous system back down to a calmer state. And I like to say that your first order of business as a teacher is to get the kids' brains calm. So that's why I think it's important to take your lesson planning book and decide where in the day you're going to put in those breaks, whether it be a breathing break or a stretch break, or just maybe rest your eyes and visualize a nice scene. There could be lots of different ways to do that. And then in consideration of kids who've been impacted by trauma, trying to think about, what situations might be triggering for those kids and anticipating those so that you can have a way to preemptively keep them calm. And it might be like during a transition, that might be a really hard time for a kid who's been impacted by trauma. It might be working with a group that might be triggering to a child. And so, whatever you know about that child's history, helping you to figure out what do I do ahead of time to pave the way so that this child isn't triggered and that nervous system isn't reactivated. So I just wanted to throw those things out. I'm gonna listen a lot to Tina like I always do. And so I'll take a stab at some answers if I feel like I have something to say. But here's a great question. Having it from Terry again, having a child with RAD, which you'll have to unpack for us, Tina, RAD or PTSD, which I think we know about. How can we support those youth who are LGBTQ who do not receive support from their families? So I think maybe Terry was saying that they personally have a child with RAD and PTSD. I'm thinking that's what, or maybe not personally, but maybe that's a student of theirs. But the question is really, how can we support those youth that are LGBTQ who don't have support from their parents or families?
Yeah, so good question, Terry. Thank you for that. And I appreciate you raising the LGBTQ community on this call, because we don't talk about it as much, I think, in some different contexts where we have a captive audience. So I want to just say that this is a community that experiences a lot of trauma for a lot of different reasons. We talk about racial trauma, and any group that's been marginalized, any group that experiences some level of inequity because of discrimination, those are groups that are going to experience trauma. And so it's important for us to be able to talk about that in this context. First of all, RAD is reactive attachment disorder, I believe, is because there's so many different acronyms out there, but that is a disorder that arises when there's been a disconnect early on in the attachment of the child with their caregiver. And so it can cause some emotional outbursts. It can create some emotional dysregulation over time where there's not been intervention or treatment. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, I think many of us are probably more familiar with that. So in an effort to address how do we deal with any of these particular diagnoses that are associated with trauma, and provide support for people who may not be getting it in their context or in their home environment. Good question, because you're serving kids every day who are not always getting support in the environments where they live. And of course, when we talk about that, we don't talk about that in a way to blame families or blame parents or look down upon the environments where people come from. There are lots of reasons why parents may not be able to connect with the child. They may be experiencing their own trauma. They may have their own mental health issues that they're battling with. So a way that we can support this community in particular, and anybody who's experiencing trauma that may not be getting support, is through a tool and a skill we call empathy. Now, here's the deal about empathy, because empathy doesn't cost us anything. It's just something that we have to learn how to do. Whenever we use an empathetic statement or have an empathetic posture, we are actually helping to calm the nervous system and the brain of someone who's experiencing trauma or who's experiencing any level of marginalization. Empathy is both cognitive, so it's part of our thinking capacity to take perspective of someone else's experience. Even if we don't agree with it, we take perspective. And then the second part of empathy is affective. So it's something that allows us to have a compassionate response to what we're seeing. And so in order to have the full range of empathy, we want it to be cognitive and affective. When we show empathy to individuals whose experiences we may not understand, that we've never lived, that we may not be able to totally ever see or experience, we are giving that person the gift of saying, I see you, you're seen, you're heard, and you matter. And all of those are the makings of a supportive system and supportive environment. And so we do some of that empathy training within some of our larger training offerings, and it is a skill. So it's not something that it's something that we have to learn to do, because we're not necessarily naturally inclined to do it. But when we show empathy, we basically are connecting to the feeling and the emotion. We're doing it non-judgmentally. And then we're giving that person just a chance to contribute to the conversation. So here's how empathy might look for just in a general example. So let's say, for instance, we have a child who is experiencing some emotional dysregulation, and maybe somebody said something to them or bullied them because they come from the LGBTQ community. So in having a conversation with someone from that background and they're talking to me, I might simply say, I know it has to be hard to not be seen and accepted for who you are. That's an empathy statement, because I've spoken to the challenge that they're having. I've also connected to particular feeling that it may be hard for them as they're talking about the difficulty. And I've given them a chance to have the opportunity to respond and not have a judgmental statement about what they're experiencing, what someone said. I just made a statement to them to begin to let them start to settle into that moment with me by way of support. So empathy statements, you can find those online. There are bunches of places to get them. We can provide some of that information. If we have an empathy handout, if you'd like that, we can certainly provide that. But the best way to provide support for anyone who's experiencing trauma, regardless of the issue, is to use empathy and to help to use regulation. Those are our two very big primary tools.
Okay, so that thank you for asking that question. Great answer, great question. Yolanda asks a question and she nods to children being resilient, which I absolutely agree with. She's asking, she says, most students have been affected traumatically by the pandemic. How do you address the emotional trauma supportively, but without causing additional trauma?
Yeah, that's a good question, Yolanda. Thanks for asking that, because we do stand the chance at times of re-traumatizing kids. So I want to answer it starting with this. Let me say that the first part of this is for adults in the system to understand that we are co-regulators. So that means that we can help to regulate kids that we are interfacing with, and also even adults, because a lot of this will translate over to parents, because we hear a lot from teachers and administrators about, having these conversations with parents, and, the parent was excited and we couldn't have this conversation. So knowing that we're co-regulators, that how we regulate our own emotions and how we are calming our own nervous systems is going to help tremendously for that environment and that context and for that person that we're talking to. So I'm going to use my own strategies and tools to calm myself. I'm going to make sure that I am using my voice of empathy, but I'm also mindful of my nonverbal cues, that they're not necessarily threatening. Because sometimes my mom used to have this statement, and I've never forgotten it. And she would say, "I see you sitting down, but you're standing up on the inside." And so what that means is that I was having one behavior, but everything about me looked as if it was not in alignment. So that congruence is important too in how we're showing up. Are kids able to look at us? And when kids are experiencing trauma and they've been used to living under threat, they're constantly scanning their environment to see if they're safe. And they can zero in on another person and tell whether or not they can feel safe with that individual, or even if they are in a safe context, if their perception is they're not safe, then those kids will stay in a trauma state. Their nervous system will stay amped up. So again, it's co-regulating. It's making sure that every part of who we are is in a state where safety can be realized in that context. And to that point, it might be important to take a break and say, if you know that you are frustrated, or if you're upset about something, or if you're triggered in some way by something that's happening, it's important to be able to say, why don't we take a moment? You can always come back to a conversation before you start. So you can take time to regulate, because again, you're a co-regulator. So that's the first thing, is just being ready to have a conversation, knowing your triggers, so that you can be in a supportive posture for that individual. And then again, the third thing would be in the conversations that you're using the empathy statements and mirroring statements. So just being able to repeat back to the individual you're talking to, a child, a student, it could be a coworker even, that you're able to mirror back so that you can let them know that you're connecting to what they're saying and that you want to hear them. So I think those would be the key things. Know your triggers, be able to regulate and settle so that you can co-regulate. And then again, be prepared for the conversation. And when you have the conversation, you'll definitely want to use your empathy statements and your mirroring and reflecting statements.
Okay, the next question comes from Terry again, and he's asked, I'm sorry, Terry, I don't know what your pronouns are, so I'll call you they, if that's okay. Terry's asking what strategies would work best for children who can't access remote learning and can't stay regulated. I'm wondering if what the meaning is here is that not that they don't have remote learning, but they can't pay attention during remote learning. Because I'm thinking, how would you know they can't stay regulated if they can't access remote learning? So I'm wondering if that's what you mean. If that's not what you mean, Terry, please let me know, and I'll rephrase for sure. Yep, can't pay attention. Okay, and you're a female. Thank you so much. That helps me to get a little bit untongue-tied here. I'll handle this just really quickly, and then Tina, you can add to this.
It's good for you.
Yeah. Response for sure. So we find that, and I think every teacher has found this over the last year, some kids do well with remote learning and some kids do not. And typically speaking, the younger the child, the worse they do with remote learning. It's just not the way that young children learn best, because they get so much information socially. So they might not hear a whole series of directions, but they can follow directions by looking around them. So that's one of the things we need to keep in mind, is what's developmentally appropriate. And so strategies that will work for children who just really have a hard time paying attention during remote instruction is to truly differentiate. So those of us who've been in education for a long time, we've heard differentiation, probably since the 70s or 80s. It's been around for quite a long time. But we always think about it as, okay, we have to do something completely different for every single student, which of course is why most of us don't differentiate very well in a whole class setting. Differentiation in terms of remote learning can look like this child doesn't do well paying attention. And so rather than having, 5 or 7 or 10 minutes of direct instruction, I'm going to give a 30 seconds of direct instruction and then give them some small task that they can do. So it might be, and I'm not going to be able to come up with something off the top of my head, but you might be talking about landforms. So you might just say, an island is a piece of land completely surrounded by water. Look at these pictures. Which one of these looks to you like an island? So that then they're disconnecting their attention from your voice and paying attention to that, to something else. So that when somebody can't pay attention, you kind of get ahead of that by purposefully breaking their attention in a way that you've programmed in, that you've planned out. So those frequent breaks with frequent opportunities for engagement. I also think it makes sense to enlist parents and family members in as much as they are able and willing to support. So maybe front loading for them what the lesson will be about, so that they can talk to their child ahead of time to say, okay, today, Ms. Vincent's going to be talking about landforms. So let's look out the window. What kind of land do you see around us? Let's look at a map. What kind of land is around our city or our state? So you can be kind of helping them to prep a little bit. So those are a couple of strategies that I would use. I would enlist parents. I would also break attention frequently. The other thing I would do is make sure that the brain is ready to pay attention by starting with a breathing exercise, so that you're priming the brain to shift attention from whatever was going on in the household before you started your instruction to the instruction. Even if you start with some sort of connection activity, which is a really strong thing to do, take a breathing break right after that to kind of re-engage the brain in focus. So those are what I would say. Tina, you want to add to that?
I think you hit them all, and especially being ready for the learning. That's so important. Starting your day off with, and we talk about morning meetings a lot here, because it does get us in a space to learn. It gets the classroom and the students in a space to learn. But especially in the age of remote learning, we have to do a lot more movement. It's a different way to learn, and you know this because it's a different way to teach. And so even for yourself, having more frequent breaks and having more times where you are regulating your system. So it's breathing, it's movement. It may be a silly game every, depending on the developmental stage of the child, but it's having a lot of different games where there's movement involved, or singing, or some kind of craft activity, and incorporating a little bit more of that, because anything that's getting the body to move is really helping to help the individual stay regulated and to calm, so they can come back into the space and allow their brains to do what they're supposed to do in learning.
I just wanted to add really quickly, it also, there's a different level of energy that you have to expend in order to pay attention online. It's very different than being in a regular classroom. And I think we all know this intuitively, but really the brain science shows us that there's so much more taxation on attention when you're on screen, and particularly in something like this, like a Zoom call, so that you're attending to lots of other visuals, including the visual of yourself, which is actually pretty stress invoking for many of us. But when you're watching yourself react, and then you get kind of self-conscious, and it's another way to divide attention. And so one of the things that's a really positive thing to do is to, get one of those timers that you can drop into your PowerPoint and give the kids a task, have them either turn their camera off, which, I guess depending on the age, you may or may not want them to do, but just you stop talking and you put the timer up, so that all they're really seeing is the timer. And then you're giving them that time in order to complete the task and then come back. So those are some strategies that I would suggest. And then a question is, what type of social emotional strategy can schools put in place in a remote learning setting so they still feel connected and able to access the learning? So there's a follow-up question to that, but that question in and of itself, in terms of how do we really connect kids, and I think this is a great question, because like many folks, I think many folks understand this. At Momentous, we truly believe that the beginning of any type of strategy has to begin with a strong relationship, a safe relationship. And so in order to create those safe relationships, it's much easier in person, obviously, because you can meet kids at the door, you give them a high five, you give them a hug, whatever it is you're doing, and you can attend to those nonverbal so much more easily than you do online, so that you're much more reactive when you see a change in a child's brain state, for instance, or their posture. You see them getting a little emotional. It's much easier to catch that face to face, which really solidifies that safe relationship. But in order to get kids to feel connected, the teachers at Momentous School have used a lot of different strategies. One of the things that they've done is during their morning meetings, they're putting kids into small breakout rooms, so that instead of having every part of the morning meeting being with the whole class, it's 2 or 3 kids together, so small groups where they're maybe talking about a prompt. So tell me, did you have any dreams last night? What did you dream about last night? Or what are you most looking forward to today? Or anything that you feel is an appropriate prompt, so that they're talking in small groups with one another. Another thing that I've seen recently, we were doing it at Momentous, but I saw it on Edutopia just recently, which is another great site if you're an educator and interested in social emotional learning. So on Edutopia, they had a little article about roomers and zoomers, meaning that, how in most classes they have kids who are in the brick and mortar, and those are the roomers. And then they have kids who are still, for lots of different reasons, being educated remotely, and those are the zoomers. So connecting a roomer with a zoomer in order to do a task. So maybe you're giving the kids some sort of investigative task where they're researching something, and you pair them up like that. So the kid who is in the class is paired with somebody who's remote. And that bridges that connection that, yes, we're in 2 different places, but we're shoulder to shoulder, just like we would be if you were here with me. So those are a couple of things I would say. Use breakout rooms to your advantage. And pair roomers with zoomers. Anything else that you wanted to add, Tina?
No, not at all. Yeah,
Okay.
great
Okay.
job. Yeah, good answer.
I also think one of the things about a safe relationship, I think safety is found in predictability. And so having the same, some of the same procedures every time that you meet. So whether it is, let's do a breathing together, and then after 20 minutes of work together, we're going to take a stretch break. So have that level of predictability. Pay attention to how you close out your sessions that are remote, so that you're having some sort of closure tradition. And that way, that predictability helps kids to feel that, oh, you know what, I know what to expect. Um, and I feel much safer in this, rather strange sort of exchange between my teacher who's on a screen and me who's sitting in my pajamas in my living room. So we're trying to normalize what certainly is not very normal. Another question is, how do we support foster children in the world of COVID?
Yeah, so I think, Rhonda, you provided a perfect segue in talking about safe relationships because, when you think about foster children, I'm going to just kind of take a little liberty with the question because I could use a little bit more detail. Is that in the classroom? Are we talking about in particular there and by way of remote learning in the world of COVID? Not sure, but I will say this much. In so much as we understand that foster kids are attending school just like homeless children, one of the things, and all other kids, just a mixture, but in particular as it relates to foster children, often there's been this moving around, so there's been transition many times. There's also been likely feelings of abandonment, feelings of rejection, and so these are all factors that can create trauma and create extra stress on a child and an adolescent. And so in an effort to really provide that support Rhonda hit it on the head. That safe relationship is foundational. And what do we know a safe relationship consists of? So if you think for yourself about what makes you feel safe, first and foremost, it's a person that allows you to be who you are, that they accept you for who you are. Even if there are things about you they would want to change or that they may not like, they accept you for who you are. So acceptance is a big part of safety. And so that's a big piece. And then the second part of it that Rhonda talked about, which was key, particularly for kids who've had that transition and that abandonment experience and rejection, is that they need a place for stability. They need adults to be consistent and to show up and to keep promises that are made, not to make promises they can't keep. And again, to really just through the relationship to demonstrate that ability to show that they are a safe person, to let that child know that they are seen, to let that child know that they are capable. So if you are a teacher, just providing those scaffolded experiences to let kids take on some tasks and some areas that allow them to own something or have ownership and feel some agency over. And then from there, continue to scaffold those things so that they can begin to feel good about themselves. Because so many of these kids clearly don't, they feel like throwaways. They feel like people don't want them. And so so many times they come into school systems and inadvertently, unconsciously, their behaviors and just in moving around different classes, or maybe not having a class schedule or routines, or just those things that kids can count on, those can keep them in a disrupted, regulated state because it's similar to what they've known in their traumatic experience. So as much as we can, even in the world of COVID, the world outside of COVID, it is really just having that safe relationship, making sure there are good routines, and that that's communicated to a child, that if there's something that's going to shift, that if you know specifically that's a child that struggles with that transition piece, or if you're going to leave for a period of time, and it may be, especially for smaller kids, it's, you know, making sure that they know, hey, I'll be back. Here's where I'm going. I'm going to, you know, be there for you. Not leaving, just need to go get, I mean, you may have to have some of those specific conversations with kids in particular who get very dysregulated if they feel that an attachment is going to happen. So, so that would be a piece of it. And then just knowing what those needs are individually. And so certainly teachers can't know everything about every child in their classroom, but most classrooms have a few kids where they, I've heard the term high flyer, but I would just simply say kids who are experiencing a lot of need, and they become dysregulated more frequently, and they need a little bit more laser support. That's how I would refer to them. And so you might have to zero in on what specifically does this child need and how can I provide that for them.
I might add to that, one of the things that there's a strategy called 2x10, which is a strategy that I'm not even sure who came up with it, but basically it's a strategy that you can use when you are dealing with a child who is, you know, it's hard to connect with. Oftentimes these are kids who might have a behavior, you know, express their themselves through, you know, behavior issues, and just can be kind of challenging. And basically what it means is you spend 2 minutes a day for 10 consecutive school days just having conversation with that child. So I wanted to take that 2x10. And by the way, the conversation has nothing to do with academics or behavior. It really is just getting to know the child. I wanted to kind of take that strategy and marry it to you know, kids who are suffering a lot of stress right now with COVID, and like kids in foster care who really, this is trauma on top of the trauma of their lives anyway. So you've got this sort of complex trauma going on. I think having that time to check in with kids just routinely. So I know some of the teachers at Momentous School, and I don't know if it's all of them, but I do know it's some of them, have built into their schedules where they're checking in with all of their kids one at a time, you know, for 5 minutes once a week, just to have a conversation about how are you feeling, how's it going, you know, how are you keeping yourself busy, You know, are you worried about anything? Those kinds of things, so that you're not necessarily opening Pandora's box, because we certainly don't expect, you know, as teachers, we can't fix everything that we would love to fix. But just being that connection person, I think, is really important. And having somebody just to make that check-in all the time. So it's not really 2 by 10, but it comes from that that notion of having a check-in person. Somebody who cares about me just as a person is really helpful. So we don't have any more questions, Tina. So maybe should we just kind of scroll through some of the, Tina mentioned some of the other trainings that might be interesting to you. So maybe we can just scroll through that.
Yeah, that'd be great. And before we go to the scroll through, I just want to recap. Like, if you were going to take away some high points from this as to first, what is trauma? And then what can I do when I'm responding to any child, no matter what community they come from, no matter what background they have? What are some key takeaways? One of the things that we sometimes do is we make it harder than it has to be. It's hard enough to connect with kids. That's the hard work, right? But sometimes we try to take on so many strategies. And it really is just a couple of strategies as it relates to trauma. So the first thing is, let's just go back to the trauma piece as a recap. The biggest thing is that it's a neurobiology response to an event that exceeds our ability to cope. And that our fight, flight, freeze, and fawn system keeps us alive. And sometimes what we've done to stay alive in one context where we've adapted doesn't always translate to another context. So that gives us a different way to look at kids that come to us, as opposed to thinking about how they're behaving. We can look at it from the mindset that, wow, these kids are doing the best they can because they've stayed alive in one context, and we have the opportunity to help them understand a different way to behave and to regulate. So that would be those two pieces, I think, for overview. As far as strategies, if you can do at least 2 things in your practice and within your school. And the first thing is to make sure that you have strategies in place to calm the nervous system. Whatever those are, try different ones. Different ones will work for different kids. So don't get discouraged. Make sure you stay with whatever strategy you pick for a period of time so people can begin to utilize that strategy. But the biggest strategy is to calm the nervous system. And then the second part of that is, as part of that big umbrella of calming the nervous system, empathy, empathy, empathy. And that is something that campuses can do that doesn't require expenses for curriculum. You'll still need to have those, but that's something that you can do that will support any child anywhere. And in addition to the regulation for the neurobiology, you're also helping to regulate through empathy. But with empathy, you're also building safe relationship and connection. So those are 2 big strategies that you can take away. Thanks, Rhonda.
All right, so just a really quick laundry list of some of the additional trainings and resources that we think would be helpful to you. The first one, and I think this is our biggest push, is our blog. So our blog is obviously free, and it gives so many great ideas, lots of good content. Sometimes our therapists write blogs. Sometimes we have experts in the field of education contribute to the blog. So it's a wide-ranging perspectives and expertise that will be shared here. But you can see, like, here's the blog that's giving you a strategy for building a pipe cleaner breathing breathing exercise. So very easy, practical stuff that we'd love for you to take a visit on. It's very well organized and nicely put together. So momentusinstitute.org/blog. If you're interested in more training, you can go to our training page for social emotional training, and you can see we have training that is on demand. So we have some online videos that you can take at any time. We also do webinars like this. Some of them are 2-parters where it's got a lot of information. So we give you some one week and some the next week. But you can see that this is how you registered probably for this one, but same thing. So momentusinstitute.org/events. And then this is our on-demand training that I mentioned. So we have lots of, we have 10 of these, some online videos that are very beautifully done. And they take the voices of our educators, our therapists, our administrators, and give you lots of views into our classrooms to see how do we apply the principles that we talk a lot about. So these are just 6 of the 10 that we offer. Each one of them comes with a viewing guide. So if you're an administrator and you want your faculty to view them, then we can offer you a bundled package, and you can use the administrator guide to kind of help you talk through that and apply, how is this going to look for my own campus? So that's a good thing to know. We do have an e-store. This is something that people have requested for a long time. So we have products that we've developed just based on our own need at our own school, and also with our partners. And so we wanted to make sure that these things were readily available to other educators and people who work with kids. So if you go to momentusinstitute.org/shop, you'll find our e-store and some of the products that we have there. We also have a curriculum, a social emotional learning curriculum that we've developed, and you can find that on our website as well. So we want to make sure that you are able to keep in touch with us. So again, we have the blog there, but we have lots of a good presence in social media. So we encourage you to connect with us and follow us. And then we can follow you back so that we can continue to learn from each other. Tina, did you have anything else you wanted to say?
No, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to tune in, because we realize that given the environment that we're in with the shifting of remote learning and in person and just trying to figure out so much, especially after Snowmageddon or Snowpocalypse or whatever you call it, Snowvid, whatever name you put on it, we're all still playing catch up. So the fact that you showed up today means a lot to us. And so if we can support you in any way, if you have other questions and you want to reach out to Rhonda and myself, please go to our website. We're on there on our About Us page. You can reach out and email us, and we'll take some time to talk with you individually if needed. But we want to support what you're doing, because what you're doing is important, and that's why we're here. So thank you for being here today.
Absolutely. Thank you all.
Okay, bye-bye.